Hello and welcome to this talk in the Transformative Play Initiative series. The Transformative Play Initiative is connected to Uppsala University's Department of Game Design and is located at Gotland in Sweden. My name is Kjell Hedgard Hugaas. I am connected to Transformative Play Initiative, and this talk will be recorded on YouTube. Will also be available there at the Transformative Play Initiative's channel. Go to YouTube and search for the Transformative Play Initiative, and you will find this talk and many others that could be of interest to you. The person we have here today to give our talk is named Hilda Levin. She is a Swedish larper living in Norway. She has a master's in Dramaturgy and wrote her thesis on Metareflection and Embodied Role-playing. She works with theater productions and emerging playwrights and has taken part in organizing the Oslo Pride cultural program in 2018, 2019, and 2023. On a personal note, I think it's kind of fun that Hilda is a Swedish larper that has moved to Norway, me being a Norwegian larper that has moved to Sweden. And it could be this little tidbit, this little fact that led to us last year at the TPI seminar. We were peer reviewing each other's conference papers. Now, I'm not going to speak for Hilda here, but I have to say it was an absolute joy to review Hilda's paper. There was very, very little I could put my finger on. And if the paper is anything to go by, I must say that the talk we're going to have today is going to be pretty amazing. And the talk that Hilda is giving is called Playing with Perspective, Metareflection and Immersion in Embodied Role-playing. And with that, I welcome Hilda here, and I will ask you all to join me in welcoming her. Hilda, over to you.
Thank you, Kjell. What a lovely introduction. And it was really interesting to read about your theories as well. And you didn't only move to Sweden, you moved to my home island, actually, which is, I really enjoy that transformative play is now on Gotland, where I come from, where there was no role-playing growing up before we started ourselves. So thank you for bringing that to my tiny island. And welcome everyone who's here to listen to my talk. I'm very flattered to be here and share my thoughts. I will start with getting my screen up. There we go. Okay, so yeah, as Kjell said, this is my talk, Playing with Perspective, Metareflection and Immersion in Embodied Role-playing. And it's based upon my master's thesis, which are trying to look at role-playing from theories in theater, earlier LARP theories, and also had some interviews with LARPers on their experience on this subject. So as a small introduction, I come from the tradition of Nordic LARP, so that's what all the examples will be about. If you're not familiar with Nordic LARP, there will be some pictures throughout so that you can relate to what we're talking about anyways. But it's a form of role-playing. LARP stands for live action role-playing that has developed within the Nordic countries and now is spread over the world in different communities. So I will talk about how aesthetic distance work in art and how that comes into play in immersion and meta-reflection when we role-play, and how we can play with that and how we can design with that in mind and what that might have to do with transformative experiences. So starting out as a theater person, what really got me interested in studying this was looking at the Brechtian influence in Nordic LARP. Because Nordic LARP started out, as many other role-playing traditions, with being working very illusion-based, where you wanted to have very elaborate costuming, very elaborate environments to go into your fiction. But as it developed, other methods were included, where we started to do what we call black box LARPs. And we started to use what they call meta techniques. And this kind of aesthetic was then in theater black boxes, where Things were more representative, more minimalistic in the aesthetics. It was, some of them were also directly inspired by Brecht or the movie Dogville. And you can see that in their scripts. So this is why I have a picture of Dogville here, looking a lot like what we may jokingly call tape larps in black boxes. And these meta techniques that they call them, that they developed in these kinds of larps, were used to stop and comment on the play, to calibrate different ways of playing, to share inner thoughts in monologues so that you could create stories more easily together. Or you could, and after a while, these techniques were so useful that we started to implement them as well into the illusion-based LARPs as well. So you could have techniques to calibrate there as well. You could have monologues breaking up the play, even though you were all in full costuming. Or you could have easier ways to calibrate consent and escalation and de-escalation, or to reach play that you cannot reach realistically in simulation in role-playing. So you can find more abstract ways of playing out violence and sex, or traveling in time or into space, or whatever you would like that is not realistically feasible. So you could use this, of course, to comment or reflect, but also just to calibrate or have fun. But I was interested in how this worked when we role play. How can we play with different levels and different aesthetics and different cognitive modes? If we look at all art, there's a fundamental rule of art called aesthetic distance. And it says that we need to see something as different from everyday life to recognize it as art. That's what makes it art. If we don't recognize it as fictional, it's just a regular object, and we will respond to it as such. And if we think about it, we will react pretty differently to someone running towards us with a sword, or someone running towards us with a buffer sword that is not real, or someone running towards us with a buffer sword that we present is a real sword. We have three very different responses there. So she says that for art to exist, distance is intrinsic to our perception of all of art, something without which the work of art or its perception as a work of art would not exist, a quality which can be emphasized or de-emphasized, but not eliminated. If I don't see something as art, it will just be an object, as I said. And many types of artworks will, of course, continue existing, even though I don't see them as art. A painting will still be there, even if I don't really think about it. But when it comes to theater and role-playing, we use real materials and real environments. And if we don't see them as differently, if we don't change our perspective, there is no role-play between us. So I have to choose to see it. And in me choosing to see it, we create art, which is quite amazing. In theater, we call it a willing suspension of disbelief, that we choose to play pretend together and act as if the fiction is real between us. So in any LARP, regardless of format, you will take on a different perspective on your surroundings, your fellow participants, and yourself. So playing with perspective is really always there. But let's go a little bit deeper than that. To understand how one might switch between different layers in LARPing and how one might reflect while being engaged in LARP, I also had to look at what we actually do when we immerse, when we get emotionally engaged. And many researchers have looked at immersion as a kind of a flow state where you become engaged emotionally and cognitively. And Bowman has described this, that we have the, Bowman is also here in this panel who invited me, have written that you might immerse into activity, game, environment, narrative, character, and community. So you might engage in a game in very different ways and still become immersed. And this is also why we might get really engaged also in minimalistic aesthetics. We can play pretend and be as emotionally engaged there as well. So it doesn't have to be illusion-based to engage just immersion-wise, even though in the immersive theater that is has been the norm to call it immersive if you have immersive environments. But the feeling of being immersed can become apparent in any extent. And some researchers then, I realized, look at theater. Here. Yes, some researchers look at how immersion is not a stable state. It's not a flow state that we just come into, then it persists. But it's one of moments and where multiple things are happening at the same time. As Stenros here describes, when you're playing, you will see the world around you in double vision. You will see the fiction as real through your character, but obviously you are also aware of the ordinary everyday world as a player. That made me really interested. Like, what's this obviously aware? How does that work? And then I realized some researchers looked at immersion as an interpretive framework. They talked about an immersive frame. And that made a lot of sense to me, coming from aesthetic distance, to look at how we could change perspective, how we could change the interpretation of our reality. From here on, I call it a fictional interpretive frame that we may immerse into. And with that, we have a real interpretive framework with how we understand reality, and we have a fictional interpretive framework with how we understand the fiction that we're engaging with. And McConaughey, who looked at theater and cognition, explained that this ability to have different logics in our mind at the same time comes from our ability to think abstractly. Because we can think abstractly, we can have different systems, different logics, different worlds in our mind at the same time simultaneously, and compare them to each other in different ways. And this is the ability that has given humans the ability to play pretend. Other species can play, but not necessarily with fiction. So he says, regarding performance, the key contribution made by conceptual integration is role-playing. And conceptual integration is just that, to be able to have different systems and concepts in mind at the same time and draw comparisons between them. And he says that when we role-play, we don't only change perspective, we don't only change from reality to fiction, but we put on a fictional perspective on the real and try to blend them as best we can together. So we don't unsee the real, we put the fiction on top of it as a filter. I think many have maybe talked about larp filter as well casually when we try to explain what we do. So it's kind of a steering of interpretation. We choose to put a fictional layer on top of our reality. And through this, we can always choose to zoom in or zoom out of, or to blend or unblend, I mean. We can choose to see the actors we would like. We can see how they work. But we usually want to see the fiction because it's usually more enjoyable. So we tend to lean towards focusing on that. But as it's a layer put upon the real, we can't really unsee the real. It will always be persistently a part of the experience. And this undermines quite helpfully the idea of total immersion that has been a kind of a myth surrounding role-playing, that it could be dangerous somehow because you could get stuck in a character and not get out. But as it's a state that you put yourself willingly into, where you steer your interpretation to see it as other than everyday life, you can't really will yourself to stop believing in reality and make it go away. And it's not something that usually happens in art experiences. Ben Chaim says we cannot will or to accept or reject what we believe to be real, but we can only become inattentive towards it. So, and when we role play, I think it's we all recognize as well that we expect everyone to keep reality in mind as well to a certain extent. A player can be deemed irresponsible if they don't make enough attention to not get so enthusiastic that they hurt somebody, for example. So it's something we expect of each other as co-players as well, to stay considerate as we play. So a successful role-playing then is not one of total immersion, but a satisfactory blending between fiction and reality, where reality doesn't bother us. And McConaughey continues to describe that according to many of the cognitive scientists who have studied it, attention is a lot like a follow spot with an adjustable opening, allowing us to take in more or less of a visual field. So if we have this fiction of this layer of fiction that we put upon the wheel, we can kind of zoom into it and try to focus as much on that as possible, try to not be annoyed by reality and just make reality play in fiction's favor. And try to immerse into seeing as much of that as possible, even though we know right at the side of our eye is reality as well. But as we can zoom in, we can also zoom out, choose to zoom out to take in more of the field, and that is more of our interpretation, where we can see the real and the fiction together, look at the blend that we have created, and use that to draw conclusions between the two and maybe find interesting insights. And that is the interpretive frame of metareflection. So a successful metareflection then would put the embodied role-playing in perspective with the outside world. And this could concern different aspects of the role-playing fiction, such as character, actions, game structure, or fictional world, or different aspects of reality, such as narrative, personal, political, or social context, or anything else that might be relevant. And I choose meta-reflection as a word for this because it means the consideration of various different points of view. And it also nicely connects to meta theater and meta techniques and other relevant terms that has to do with this state of mind. And this separates meta-reflections that are about both reality and fiction from reflections that solely have with the role play to do, such as how can I seize the throne, or separate from reflections that only have to do with reality, such as will the larp stop before my parking ticket runs out. And any participant have this ability with them, because if they can role play, they can also they can see these different frames and to engage in the play, and they can then also zoom in and out on them. And they can use it to maybe realize that the game reminds them of some real life power struggle, or maybe they think that they have a narrative that is too cliche and they want to nuance it somehow. Or they maybe see that they are playing themselves towards a memory that they would like to play deeper to or further away from. So in that way, you can engage more or less with things that you're interested in, and you can gain interesting insights to what we are doing. And when I started approaching this from the distanced reflection point of view, I kind of thought that we would have like we have immersing in fiction, and then we have reflective reality, but that's not what's happening here. This way of thinking helps us to see that a meta-reflection is not in contrast to the fiction. It needs the fiction to be relevant and to be, it's an interactive relationship between the two. And it doesn't have to be on the expense of immersion, because it can actually draw the participants closer to the fiction because it becomes more relevant to them. Maybe they find interesting correlations between their life and the fiction. And it's really different playing rooms that opens up if we try to go into a meta-reflective state, or if we are not really into the fiction. Maybe we are bored and can't be as engaged as we wish we would be. Maybe we have to stop the game and take a break, and that's a very different room from if somebody uses a meta technique together. So meta-reflexive methods might break the flow of the play, but they won't stop the play from happening as it would if you need to ask people for a break. So when considering, meta-reflection as term in theater, I was also aware of the other terms, metaxis and aesthetic doubling. And I tried to look into them as well, and decided that they were too blunt to talk properly about these things. And they have also been very variedly used. Metaxis is Wall's term for, and in different pedagogues' translations, it has been used very, very differently. From just talking about two parallel worlds to talking about the phenomena that might happen from engaging in a fictional world. And aesthetic doubling as well, I find very blunt, because it just describes this premise of, yes, I have my body and my character is here at the same time, but it's very static. It doesn't really say how we can use that, other than that, of course, it does give possibilities for transfer of knowledge and emotion, but yeah, it's very static. So instead of trying to use these terms that vary so much between different users and that try to catch all cognitive processes during an aesthetic experience, or all moments when a phenomenon might lead to specific results or realizations, or just the premise of role-playing, I thought that the meta-reflexive frame was more exact, because it talks only about how we work with interpretation. It doesn't try to understand everything else. And also it's conjugable, so we can talk about specific things at specific times. So through the term meta-reflection, we can then go into detail and talk about the meta-reflexivity of embodied role-play, which is the aesthetic premise of simultaneous presence of reality in fiction, which may be implicit or explicit in this design within embodied art forms. So that would I think be synonymous with aesthetic doubling. We can talk about the frame of meta-reflection for the individual player that makes it possible to understand this premise and take part in embodied role-playing. We can talk about to meta-reflect when a player is actively using their frame of meta-reflection to put the fiction into perspective with reality, or the other way around. On meta-reflection, a specific comparison that the player finds between a role-playing fiction and their reality. Methods for meta-reflection that facilitates and encourages players to meta-reflect. Or methods that are using the meta-reflexivity of the embodied role-play with other purposes than to increase meta-reflection, such as mentioned earlier, to overcome the material premise of embodied role-play, to travel in time and space, act out violence or sex, or facilitate communication and calibration between players. So it doesn't, in this way, it doesn't try to explain which emotional effects this can have or which knowledgeable effects this can have, but just how they might come about, and when it comes to interpretation. And how we then might play with that interpretation. And if we want to look at emotional effects, for example, we would have to combine with other theories such as bleed theory, etc. But hopefully that makes it easier to talk more exactly. So when we are playing with meta-reflection, then this is something that any player can do at any given time when they LARP. They can zoom out when they feel the need to, or and of course, this helps to contextualize the LARP experience and to inform the LARP experience and to inform back out to the world afterwards. But you can also always contextualize and process after the LARP as well. So it's not always necessary to design specifically for meta-reflection. And it's not guaranteed that it's successful, so it could break the flow of the players, but it might also as well, of course, enrich the play. And design might work as a reminder or request to use this perspective in a specific way. So it's, as you've probably understood, very practical for context and meaning making. And through these layers that are active at the same time, we can have an ongoing dialogue between fiction and reality also while we play, if we would wish to, and to enjoy different layers of the experience as well. Sometimes it's wonderful to just immerse and try to be in the moment, but sometimes it can be really beautiful as well to see all the layers that are going on. One example I would like to share here is from Just a Little Lovin', that is on the picture as well, which is a LARP about the queer community in the 80s that get hit by the HIV crisis. And I played it myself in 2016 and organized it in 2022. And here, the awareness of history will always be present when we play, at least, or at least often, if we will compare what we are doing with how it could have been like in history. And of course, it's always emphasized that we can't experience what were actually the experience of living then, but this is this ongoing dialogue between the two. And when I was there in 2022, not only could I look at our version of 1984 and reflect on that, but I could also reflect on my memories from 2016. That was also part of how I saw what was happening. And this could also get mixed up with, there was this activist group that started, or there were some characters that started an activist group that did political protests with circus acts. And I learned that one of these players who then played an activist in 1984 with his prop had also used this prop out in real life in the early 2000s in similar protests. So there were so many different years active at the same time, so many different layers of history in a moment of play. And that can be really wonderful as well to just to see that they are active as well. And to think about how meta-reflection works in this interactive way between what the player knows and what happens to the character, it makes it also very clear that it might be needed to give players some information beforehand if they're supposed to use it in play. Because we can't meta-reflect over things we have no idea about. So you might have to infuse your LARP with the knowledge that you want the participants to have. And sometimes that comes also just through having different participants there with different lived experience. So it might be very valuable to plan for shared spaces to talk about this context, or either before or during or after the LARP, depending on the LARP. And it can be really valuable to get to engage in collaborative meaning making, and maybe also, especially when it comes to historical play or real life issues, be able to adjust the experience after the LARP with some actual facts. And this kind of play where we might, when we role play lives and times that we haven't experienced ourselves, we might get new insights about other social groups or other people's lives. And Hugaas, who so kindly introduced me, has written about the term mimetic lead, where you can then draw insights from that experience and learn new things through LARPing. Which then, of course, might need to be adjusted, because LARP is, of course, not life, but we might get insights that might enlighten life for us. Metareflection is also important for processing and getting new input while we LARP. Some downtime might be what we need to process where we are and see where we want to go up ahead. And not just go with the flow, because even though immersion is an enjoyable flow state, it might make us go with what we come up with first. And sometimes it's nice to look at what the second idea might be, or the third. And Bergman Hamming and Bergman Hamming, that are LARP designers, have coined the term breathe and dive for how they design their LARPs, where they think it will work best, or we can get the most intense experiences if we dive down into immersion and then go up for a breather, reassess where we're at, and then dive back down again. And Nordblom and Westborg also calls this, likens this shifting with playing a football match, where you as a player just doing as best you can and going for it out on the field, can then sometimes take on the perspective of the football coach looking for interesting play up ahead. So the metareflective frame then is a really important aspect of narrative agency, to choose where we want to go with our play, and with steering, which is to where the player takes decisions for the character because they find an interesting path that they want to experience. And if we look at the theories emerging on transformative role-playing, researchers such as Kemper, who looks at what she calls emancipatory bleed, which is a kind of where she looks for emotional experiences in LARPs that can work cathartically for struggles that she has in real life, or experiences that she haven't had in real life but would like to have. And she calls that, so she can steer for these kinds of experiences in what she calls navigational play. So in this way, metareflection can also be an important aspect of reaching those kinds of transformative play. So you can go for interesting paths or emotions, or even practical experiences that you would like to have. And of course, a transformative experience will never be guaranteed, but we might steer towards things that are interesting to explore. And Kemper also says that an important part of her strategy to get a lot out of her LARPs is to have some breaks where she creates memories from the LARP taken at specific times. So she can write letters, for example, or collect memorabilia, so that she can return to specific moments in the LARP later on, and not only to the post-LARP narrative that maybe cleans some things up afterwards. Yeah, so that's also a way to take time to process while we play. And as mentioned before, when we know that we have these layers of metareflection that we might move into, that is there all the time, it's quite easy also to allow for meta techniques in any LARPs, because it will always be available. And then we can always use our methods for content-based LARPing, which is of course a core value for transformational play. We cannot play courageously together to unknown places within ourselves if we cannot ask for permission, or we are able to step out if we would like. So that's really important. And calibration underway can also be really nice to allow for collaborative playing to interesting places. Where we could imagine that we collaboratively can engage in navigational play, and we can support each other to steer for transformational experiences together. So yeah, I think just thinking about the possibilities that we have while using different levels can really open up as well for a lot of wonderful co-creation. Yeah, I will soon go into some concrete examples from LARP practices in how they play with this. But first, I will do some more theory. I want to go back to Bertolt Brecht again and look at how we might play with perspective aesthetically in LARP as well. And when Brecht started out to use his techniques that could remind us of our meta techniques that breaks the play in different way to comment upon it or emphasize something, he said he did that because he created this alienation effect, as he called them, when he makes something strange. He says the audience for the epic theater is expected to perceive alternatives to the events, different options open to the characters, different outcomes for the various events, alternative social systems or frames of references. So he used it to kind of wake the audience from immersion into the play, to see the systems he presented, the power struggles he presented, and how they might take part in changing them, instead of just accepting them as static. And as I've talked about reflection, Brecht wasn't against immersion either, because he needed to get the audience emotionally involved for them to care about what he wanted to talk about. But he wanted them to also question what he was showing them, not only accept it. And his alienation techniques and performativity, the overemphasis play and things like that, is still used in political theater to make us question things we might otherwise take for granted. This is also how some of the early meta techniques were asking to be used, that they directly drew their inspiration from Brecht. This is from the early black box LARP When Our Destinies Meet, where they say, we ask the player to interrupt their immersion into the character and story and start looking at what is happening and how it happens. So Brecht played with shifting perspectives aesthetically as well. We have talked about shifting perspectives in many different ways, but how can we, if we shift perspectives with insights, that is of course very possible, but how may we shift them aesthetically, and what could that bring? So Ben Chime, that I've quoted a lot today, because she wrote a book called This Is in the Theater, that is really interesting. She says that the emotional engagement from the audience in a theater play has to do with two axes. It's the awareness of fiction that can pull them into immersion or make them aware of fiction, or it's the level of empathy or humanization, as we call it, which can be high or low. And I will give you a very nerdy graph here. And in any given play, you can have a high level, or in any aesthetic, you can have a high level of humanization, which is also why the minimalistic or representative black box LARPs can be really emotionally engaging as well, because they might be full of humanized content. So if you have any story, you can choose to put it in anywhere on this. If we imagine that this was a chart, you could put it anywhere here, depending on what you would like to tell and how you would like to tell it. But then you can also shift between them. And I will give some examples so that it becomes more concrete. Imagine if we start with other artworks that are a bit less complicated than LARP. If we watch a realistic film, for example, we will have a low awareness of fiction. It will be very lifelike, but maybe high humanization. We feel with the character, we root for them. But it might maybe suddenly it drops down to a twist, and we see that this character, why do we have empathy for him? Is a douchebag. So the film all of a sudden turns down their level of humanization and makes us re-examine our empathy. And this manipulation of perspective can take any path depending on the established premise. So you can switch anywhere you like for effect. You can have a farce that is you think is only fun until all of a sudden it's very serious, and you're like, oh shit, I was laughing, but it's actually about real stuff. Or it can be a very sad scene that erupts in comedy, and have a point about that. Or you can have something that starts out as realism and then becomes very strange, and you're like, oh, is this what we do every day, really? If we look at the Brechtian plays, he was usually in a high awareness of fiction in his aesthetics and high level of humanized content with a lot of empathy of the people involved, but could switch down to any of the other places at when he saw fit for his point. And these kinds of shifts in aesthetics and playing with different meta levels is something that usually develops as art forms mature. We can see it in film, we can see it in theater, and we can also see it now in LARP. And they give us more means of communication, especially when we want to show important turning points. But a shift in itself doesn't bring any thoughts on it. A shift in itself won't bring any thoughts to the audience or the player, because just shifting aesthetics doesn't really have any content. It needs to be prepared and loaded with something. So you can bring attention or nuance to something that is already there. So any shift will be a play between form and content. And this goes especially for LARPs, because as we established, LARPers, for a LARP to exist, LARPers need to collaborate in seeing it. So if you as a designer choose to make sudden twists and turns in either form or content that they are not prepared for, they won't follow and they won't see the LARP that you planned for. And maybe it will even fall apart. So you can't, if you have this master plan of how you want to change the LARP, you really have to work with getting the players on board with that. They also want to follow you in that. I think that's a really good idea. If we compare it to film or theater as well, role-playing is a lot more complicated, because in film or theater, we would have one narrative that everybody follows that can then switch. But LARPs are individualized. Everyone has their own story. So if you try with a too rigid method when you want a certain direction in content at a certain time, it might be irrelevant to many of the players who might be someplace completely else in their content. So to design for this, I will give some examples of some very interesting ways to use this later on. I would advise to have openness in how you design it, so that the players can fill it with meaning as well, because it's not really interesting to nobody likes to be told what an artwork is really about, and especially not if you take part in creating it as well. So be open with that the players can fill it with meaning themselves, and try to be, if you want a shift that includes everybody, try to hit the general themes that will be interesting for everyone. So try to allow for individual journeys, individual conclusions, explorations, and maybe even let the players be in charge of how to use it and when. That could be just as interesting. But the combinations that you see are endless, because you can switch anyway from any premise. So I hope that you get inspired to play around with that. So I will finally go into examples from LARPs for those of you who have waited for that. And now I will talk about metareflexive strategies, both aesthetic shift that we talked about here, but also for contemplation or contextualization. So in the LARP practice today, we have some explicit shifts that we use, that some designers use. Of course, all LARPs are different. So one explicit shift, the most explicit shift we have, is to have act breaks in the LARP. That means that we play We might play for some hours, and then we have some hours break, where we can calibrate and discuss or contemplate to see where we want to go next. And this is quite a gentle method for because switching very harshly between or fast between different levels can be taxing as well, and it can stop the flow states that we sometimes try to reach. So this allows for deep immersion while playing, and it allows for calibration when not playing. And it also has the really good aspect of being a shared metareflexive space where the entire player group can calibrate together. And some researchers, that is Bowman and Hugaas and Bowman and Gerge, has pointed out that shifts between in and off game might actually build off-game relationships in the LARP, because then we relate to each other more as players as well. And that might be an important aspect as well to include in your design if you want to do something community-wise with your LARP. Act break might be a quick way to that as well. And meta rooms and break rooms that I also included is a meta room is when you integrate rooms to play more representatively in an illusion-based LARP, where you, for example, can play flashback scenes or dream scenes. And break rooms are just rooms to take a break, and they can also give the same breather as an act break does, but only then for the people who are in that room. LARPs are very easy to modify as an art form. We can edit them whenever we want. So I find that also really interesting. We can go back and change scenes. We can play them from different perspectives. We can deconstruct them in different ways. I think that's mostly done in freeform scenarios as of now, but I think it's an interesting importance that our art form had, that it's so much easier to change it than and maybe rewrite the rules than if we watch a movie, for example. So, and there's a lot of methods from form theater as well that could be relevant as inspiration. And we can interrupt the play with a monologue with inner thoughts, which is maybe mostly about the fiction, but as the player then will have more information than the character, it can be used in steering to more drama, which is always fun. And more explicitly, in the early black box LARP, When Our Destinies Meet, you could also choose to have a player's monologue. So you could interrupt the play with a comment from you as a person and not your character, which might be interesting in some games as well. More subtle shifts are when it's integrated into the play, so it doesn't really stop the flow, but it's part of the game. And that can be integrated meta communication, which is things that tie into the aesthetic shift that we just talked about, where you can emphasize or comment on certain aspects of the game, such as overly stylized actions, behavior, coded words, audiovisual communication that put emphasis on something in your LARP. I think there's a lot to learn here as well from post-Brechtian political and feminist theater to play with performativity and what is normal and how can we make it strange and things like that. But really good examples are from LARPs from Anna Karin Linde called, one is called A Monkey That Looks a Lot Like You, which is a LARP about teenagers and how they regulate emotion. And then there's a rule in this LARP called Doing the Monkey, where you have to goof around. And this comes into play whenever someone gets emotional, serious, or says that's not funny. The other players have to do the monkey and goof around to emphasize how this goofiness is a composite flight behavior. And what she does here is the play, the regular play then is quite high in humanization and low in awareness of fiction because they're playing regular people. But then whenever things get emotional, she shifts this straight down to low humanization with no empathy for the characters and high awareness of fiction, where you goof around way more than you would in real life. So that's an aesthetic shift loaded with content, emphasizing what's important about the game. In another larp from her called Joachim about bullying, you're also everyone is playing at a party where everyone is pretending that everything is fine, even though they are in a very serious bullying situation. And this play would be interrupted by characters having monologues about how they actually feel. But to resume the ongoing party and that atmosphere, every monologue is instructed to end with all players roaring of laughter before going back to the party. So she has turned up the humanization really high in the monologues where they share their actual anxiety, and then turns it firmly low in the laughter before resuming play. And we can also play with, we can have internal metareflection, which of course the players will do at any time, but you can design to facilitate it as well. And it's probably the most common because it doesn't break the play, and the level that the participant engages with, it can be chosen individually. And of course, that has the downside of not being in collaboration with others, usually. One such way of encouraging meta-reflection without breaking the play is to create sharp choices where the player has to choose something that makes them reflect on where they want to go with their play onwards. So it's kind of an imposed steering, having the players think about where they want to go. One example is the larp Innocence, where you play clowns that have run away from the circus. And you get symbolic props that give you abilities that you become very proud of. And at a certain time, you have to decide if you want to give these props away to never have these abilities again. But if you don't, you lose your chance to ever returning home to your circus. So then you have to decide as a player which game you want to play, which end you want to have. Just a little Levin again, because they have great method techniques. They serve a green drink at midnight, which is instructed to mean that to work as a reminder that the player should go explore what you want to explore and can shift gears, can shift direction if you want to. So it's kind of a reminder and alibi to steer for the exploration you want to. And this kind of contemplation can also be, other than about the narrative, it can also be more processing the content, such as in Just a Little Levin. Oh, sorry, I jumped. In Just a Little Levin, you end each act with estimating your risk of infection. So you have to think back on your character's action and put 1 to 5 notes with your name on it in the death lottery. So then you have to think about how did my character, how will my character's action affect their life? Or in the LARP, Have You Come Here to Play Jesus? That is about having a very sick family member and having to make a decision about euthanasia. It ends with everyone having to vote, so they have to come to a conclusion about what they think is morally right. And of course, you can have moments for contemplation and processing, which can happen just by downtime. Maybe that's planned for, maybe the players take it whenever they want to, which they will of course do in any LARP. But you can also plan this downtime where you can have activities such as writing letters or painting or condensing and materializing the experience while doing it in certain ways. One cute little example is the LARP to Android's Dream, where they try to create a Blade Runner city in a black box. So to do that, they have different locations in the city, and to move between these locations, you have to go to the bus stop and wait for 2 minutes, and then you could move on. And in the interviews that I did, this was one of the examples that the players thought worked really well metareflexively, because they got just this tiny break to reassess and went fresh into the next scene. So sometimes it can just be 2 minutes. We can also emphasize the metareflexive layer in different ways in the design. We can work with transparency, which means that we as players know more than our characters, which is very common in the Nordic larp tradition. We know all the secrets, so we can create all the drama. So it's the opposite of secrecy, where you know what your character knows and have to figure stuff out. And it helps in steering, of course. Then the steering metareflexive thoughts will be more there. If you have a thin character with not very many characteristics, it might be more plausible that you think, what would I do in this situation? There are some LARPs that play with characters playing characters, such as The Solution or the actors troupe in Inside Hamlet. And then you introduce another fictional frame to have control over. So you have fiction 1, if you have fiction 2, you have reality, and then you can metareflect on all 3 of them. So this, of course, brings you some more, you need to think more clearly about how to move between them. And of course, presence of reality in environmental content will make us more aware of this as we play, such as we talked about if it has historical content, such as 1942 or Just a Little Lovin', we will compare our play to how it could have actually been more often. And it can also be in the surroundings, in the environment, such as pervasive LARPing, such as Home Planet, which took place in Oslo city center. So there are some methods which we can do while we LARP, but Bowman and Hugaas points out that the role-playing experience itself is only truly transformative if it impacts the participant's life in some meaningful way after the event. So regardless of how strong the experience is to be transformative, we need to integrate. And a meta-reflection is, of course, about what we do while we LARP, and we can prepare it for better meta-reflection, we can facilitate for meta-reflection, but the integration and processing will happen after the LARP. And as such, it doesn't have anything directly to do with meta-reflection. But when looking at the integration practices that Bowman and Hugaas presents, they have a lot of different activities listed up in these categories, such as creative expression, intellectual analysis, emotional processing, returning to daily life, interpersonal processing, community building. And a lot of these activities can actually might be prepared and aided by having good meta-reflexive design in the LARP, such as quite obviously the intellectual analysis. If we've gotten some context and facts and information and why we LARP, we have already started on some of that integration work. And I would like to bring back the point about how shifts between in and off game might build off game relationships between the players. Because a lot of these points under emotional processing, returning to daily life, interpersonal processing, and community building, they are relational practices. They help if we have relationships to share them with and process with. So if you can do things that build relationships between within the participant group, and one of those things can be meta-reflexive strategies, that might also strengthen the basis for integration work afterwards. And in the best of cases, it might also create transformational communities where players can keep meeting up and keep being a supportive environment for experimenting with new sides of ourselves, but in real life and not just in fiction. So to sum up, in my experience, it's when I immerse deeply into something previously unknown that I get transformative experiences while LARPing myself. And we might realize that this was important to us after LARP. Maybe it's a short LARP that won't benefit from too many interruptions. Or yeah, even the most escapist LARP may lead to new experiences and transformative experiences. So metareflexive design can be whatever it needs to be in your LARP. But using metareflection, the level of metareflection might help me steer towards transformative experiences. It might help me realize what I found and help me deepen it there and prepare me for integration work. So to sum up the most important points, metareflection makes it apparent that we might help the LARP have an impact by preparing needed context and knowledge base and allow for sharing of thoughts on the way. It opens up for a lot of different design possibilities that I'm really excited about to see in the future. It allows for calibration that helps us play courageously. And design needs to be open for individual lived experience and individual LARP experience to be most effective. And we should always try to trust the interpretive abilities of the participants, because if they can role play, they can also play with the different levels of role playing that comes with the ability. So remember to onboard them and invite them to interesting ways to explore your theme and invite them to different interesting ways to interpret it as well, and allow for pluralism. And last but not least, facilitating for in and off-game relationships might enhance integration practice. So I hope you enjoyed the talk with this weird format where I can't see you, and that you got inspired to play or design in new ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hilda. I feel like I've watched one of those videos, you know, where you zoom out through the universe and you see how big the universe is and how much there's to think about that you don't consider in everyday life. There's applause in the chat, and everything is people are really, really happy. As we're reeling from this expanding experience, some questions have come in, and I just think, since we're already in this expanded space, let's do a question that is probably somewhere in the same sphere. And the question is, what does the process of meta-reflection during LARP reveal to us about human consciousness, in your opinion?
That's a very big question, yeah.
That's why we start with that.
But yeah, no, I think there are always, I'm not an expert in the human condition, but I'm of course thinking back to McConaughey's theories on this, how we can have different systems in our minds at the same time, how we can play with different levels, focusing in, focusing out. So it makes me pretty aware that there are many, many things happening at the same time in our mind, and a lot of what we consciously are aware of is what we're focusing on. And there's a lot of other things happening at the same time, regardless of where our focus is.
Yeah. Also, I can ask you to stop sharing so that people can see your wonderful face a little bit bigger format as we're doing this Q&A. We have something that might be a little bit less expansive, but might be a little bit more personal, and you're free to answer this if you want to. You also don't have to. Would you be comfortable sharing a meta-reflexive experience you have had through LARP that was particularly transformational for you?
Yeah, like I said, my most transformational experiences have come up through immersion, but meta-reflection can be a tool to bring me there in a way. So usually I stumble upon something that I didn't know before, and that's what I need to all of a sudden integrate into my persona. Yeah, I think I too we're all like baby transformative players still, so I don't have the best toolbox yet, but when it has happened to me so far, yeah, the strongest experiences have been through immersion, but I am able to immerse there because of good design, because of safe collaborative play. But a metareflection that stuck with me is the one I described, where I looked at the Just a Little Loving scene, and I could see our idea of 1984 together with how they played it in 2022, together with my memories of a really strong experience in 2016. I can kind of see the ghosts of those characters that I knew in that LARP dancing with all the others. And I knew that this one player had this prop that was actually a queer activist prop that was used 20 years ago. So like you can have, for me, that was a really beautiful moment of where different times melted together. And it was also an aesthetic moment. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it's heartening for all of us, I think, to hear that the expert on meta reflection also says that she's still developing her tools. It's absolutely a process to become more aware as players, and also to realize what we're seeking, what kind of play we're seeking, and what we can do with it. As you know, I'm very much into the integration part myself.
I think, of course, yeah, I think we all have moments where we can use like meta techniques that have kind of shifted the game in interesting ways. Like if someone has a monologue where you're all of a sudden like, oh shit. So of course that can have an impact on us. Yeah, but it's all about the stories, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, and that brings us into an interesting question, because you talked about when you were talking about Janaea Kemper's navigational play, you talked about her technique of stopping at points in the LARP to write letters or to somehow document what was happening right there, and you kind of put up this. You have the meta reflection, and then you have the narrative that we tend to create afterwards. And this also it's similar to what you mentioned about Just a Little Loving, where you have the subtle shifts with the green drink, for instance. I trying to formulate the question from comments that came in, but I think the question is there the tendency we have to create narratives, which is very human, is that in opposition to meta reflection?
No, I don't think so, because we use it in meta-reflection rather. Like if you remember the model of how meta-reflection works, narrative is one of the aspects that we compare the play to. But narrative is a simplification of what's going on. It's it's the zoomed out thing, because when we actually play, 1,000 things are going on. So the narrative is like the story that we can distill from that moment. I think that Simon Bryn has written about this, and what he calls narrative is the story we make up that happened after the LARP. So it's a simplification, but I use it as well in when we zoom out to see like, okay, where am I at? Where do I want to go? Because you see it as a kind of simplified path with different ways to go. So no, I don't think it's in opposition. It's a tool that we use for meta-reflect. Yeah.
So kind of meta reflection allows for a more accurate and maybe more multifaceted narrative afterwards.
Yeah, and see different possibilities for the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely.
But maybe I didn't understand what you meant with an opposition, or.
Well, maybe I didn't even understand the question myself. It's so fascinating, and I think it's important to remember that this is really avant-garde. This is very at the brink of our understanding of what happens when we role play today.
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of the things, and yeah, both you and Sarah and other researchers research other things. So I think we just need to build a big
absolutely. And that brings us to a theory question. You had a picture up on one of your slides where you had meta-reflection in this dotted line around reality and play. And the question is, why is meta-reflection around reality, not inside of it?
Because it encompasses both reality and fiction. It's that abstract way of thinking where we can put, okay, we have fiction, we have reality, and we have blended them like this. That's interesting. Maybe this has something to do with that. So it's a place where we can actually zoom out on reality as well. We can look at our idea of reality in a way.
Yes.
Because what it explains is, of course, not exactly what is happening, but it's a map of how our idea of the game and our idea of life works together.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
You mentioned meta-reflection might break the flow of the game. Do you think that zooming out might have potential for leading players to opt out? If so, how would you think this should be considered in game design?
Yeah, there are different, if I think back on the masters, you have like the different reasons to allow for more organic processes as well. Like what I said, like anyone can meta-reflect at any time. So, but if you have meta-reflective methods that interrupt the game in different ways with an ask for meta-reflection from the players or an ask to use them, it might break the flow of immersion unless this is the level that this game is supposed to be at. Maybe you immerse in a meta-reflexive play as well. That can, of course, also be an activity. Okay, digression. So when we go deep into immersion, other organic processes start happening as well. So when we shift out of it, we might stop something that we're about to happen emotionally. So sometimes it's nicer for players to be able to regulate that themselves. But it depends always on the content and the story and the aesthetic you want to go into. And I also learned that it can be quite different for different players. Some players don't have any issue with shifting quickly and all the time, and some players think it's really annoying and it really stops there because people are very different when it comes to imagination as well. Some people can quickly imaginate, some people have to work up to see this fiction and work up being engaged with it, and if that's interrupted all the time, then they kind of lose what they have been working for. And then just generally, humans are better at doing one thing at a time, especially when it comes to our mind, than to do both things a little bit all the time. So that's also why some designers advise that we allow for breathing and diving, because we can enhance the play when we are allowed to do both. But if we try to do both at the same time continuously, we might not get into the depth of either. Yeah.
Breathe and dive. It's such evocative language, right? I really love that those words as well. But also, I think maybe here the mixing desk of LARP is also interesting, because any type of game design, it's very seldom a binary choice, yes or no. It's very often a slider or a spectrum of like how much should you related to the LARP as well.
Yeah, and if you're already in a minimalistic aesthetic, if it's supposed to be an abstract LARP, maybe meta techniques is not annoying at all. And yeah, I think it depends on a lot of factors. But meta reflection, as it's interactive between your life and the play, it can of course also engage further if you can realize why this character is so upset and just go deeper into it as well. So it's not in opposition, but for some it can be interrupting. Yeah,
absolutely. So how might experiences with meta techniques in play impact our understanding of ourselves and our relationship with others in daily life? Another big one.
Yeah.
This is what you get for presenting on such a wonderful and expansive.
All of a sudden, I have to be an expert on life too. What? I just study art. But yeah, I do think, like, even though anyone can shift between these levels if they can LARP, I also think it's an ability that we can train to get better at, and maybe quicker shift between more extreme versions. Maybe the first meta technique you learn is like, whoa, what? And then we get better and better at it. And I think I at least talked to, this is very anecdotal, this is not research, but I talked to a psychologist at Knutbo who was really enthusiastic about this, because she meant that what you try to do in therapy a lot of the time is to allow for a patient that is over-engaged emotionally with something to get this meta-reflective perspective, or to get up and look at their situation and reassess, instead of just being in the emotion and not being able to escape. So she said that this was really interesting because this is a trait that can be trained. So maybe if we train being emotional in LARPs and then shifting out in and out of it, we can also train shifting in and out of emotions in real life as well. And yeah, zoom in and out in real life as well. So maybe LARP is really useful to be more versatile humans.
That is super interesting. It's also very much in the times now to use role-playing more and more by therapists in therapeutic settings. And so I think meta-reflection absolutely has a role to play, and as a concept in that as well. Let's see, going through the questions here. Have you looked into other models of attention, like absorption and transportation?
No, I have not. As I study art, I have taken the short route of using theories that already exist in theater and LARP on cognition. So I'm not an expert in cognition in itself, only on the theories that exist in theater already.
You're not an expert yet. I just wanted to share a comment that came in here, not a question. I love the model you presented. I recognize my own play differencing between meta-reflection and degrees of immersion. Not a question, really. You should explore your model in a PhD project. That is why I said maybe not an expert on cognitive yet, but this is absolutely, I think for those of us who are engaged in this field, this is absolutely something that I would support as well. We really want to see more of it. We can sense immediately that there's real substance here. So I will support that comment from our viewer there.
Thank you so much. I've been thinking about it as well, especially since what I've done now is to look at the practice that already is there, that has come up just because designers have found the need for it in their designs. But I haven't seen, like, it would be really interesting to go into designing specifically with certain effects in mind, and see how can we then play with the levels if that's what we're researching. And also now I have only looked at moments because that's the first thing you can look at, but I'm also really interested in how LARPs are durational. It goes on for some time, and how can we work them with, like, as I was talking about, preparing the players for some shifts, or how can one shift in for the first act prepare for a shift in Act 2 that can become something mind-blowing in Act 3, while still allowing for this pluralist open play. I think there's so much we can try out there. Yeah.
Absolutely. But, and this is actually a little bit of different approach to it, a question about how do you handle situations where co-players are resistant to active meta-reflection?
How I handle?
I think the question could also be like,
if you play and others don't want to meta-reflect.
Yeah, are you dependent on the willingness of your co-players to engage in this meta-reflective?
Not necessarily. I mean, I have emphasized that it can be really constructive to have shared meta-reflective spaces where you can calibrate and discuss together, because several minds are more than one, and because we co-create together, it's really great to be able to get on board in any way we can. But as anything else, a LARP-based and leisure-based, it should all, of course, be consent-based. So I don't think that we can expect everyone to be there for our meta reflection if we want to share it. Maybe we will have to find somebody else to share it with us. We can, of course, everyone would have to follow consent rules for calibration, but other than that, I think it's also important to allow people to opt out. Maybe they have other needs for processing. Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't know about the rest of the people here, but I could just sit here and listen to Hilda answer questions about everything from cognition and life advice to game design and dramaturgy as well. But sadly, I have to say that we are running out of time. So
well,
on
let
behalf
me know
of
and I will have a copy. So,
absolutely, I'll take you up on that
yeah.
whenever we have the chance.
Yeah.
So on behalf of the Transformative Play Initiative, we thank you so much for this wonderful, wonderful talk and for your generous answering of the questions. And as we have said earlier, this talk will be available on YouTube, so you can go back and revisit it. Everyone who's attended here, there's certain to be stuff that you missed on the first view because this is really, really fascinating and deep stuff. At the Transformative Play Initiative, this seminar series, we don't have, as of right now, the details for our next event, but we will have an event coming up soon. There are so many avenues that we are exploring right now, and people have been incredibly generous with their time and their energy and wanting to be part of this project. And with that, once again, we have the Transformative Play Initiative at Uppsala University's Department of Game Design here on Gotland. And thank you all very, very much for attending and have, I was going to say have safe travels home, but I imagine most of you already are at home, but stay safe and we will see you again soon.